Hello everyone, I am the Seleni, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first thing Marcus noticed about Melbourne wasn't the famous coffee culture or the street art that sprawled across every available surface like urban veins. It was the sound. The city hummed with a frequency that seemed to vibrate through his bones, a low, persistent thrum that he couldn't quite place. As his taxi wound through the labyrinthine streets from Tullamarine Airport, past the Yarra River's muddy embrace, and into the heart of the CBD, Marcus pressed his face against the rain-streaked window and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. He'd come to Melbourne to escape. Sydney had become unbearable after the divorce, after the job loss, after everything fell apart like a house of cards in a cyclone. His mate Dave had offered him a place to crash, a converted warehouse in Fitzroy that came with the promise of cheap rent and no questions asked. What Dave hadn't mentioned was that the warehouse sat at the mouth of one of Melbourne's most notorious laneways, a narrow concrete gullet that locals called Sorrow's End. The taxi driver, a weathered man with hands like leather and eyes that seemed to have seen too much, glanced at Marcus through the rearview mirror as they pulled up to the address. "You sure this is where you want to go, mate?" he asked, his voice carrying the distinctive Melbourne accent that turned vowels into something almost musical. This part of Fitzroy, it's got a bit of a reputation. Marcus paid the fare and hauled his single duffel bag from the boot, the weight of his possessions, everything he owned now, surprisingly light in his hands. The warehouse loomed above him, 6 stories of red brick and steel that had been carved into apartments sometime in the 90s. Sorrow's End stretched away, to his left, disappearing into shadows that seemed deeper than they should be, even for 3 in the afternoon. The laneway was narrow enough that a person could stretch their arms and almost touch both walls, lined with dumpsters and tagged with graffiti that looked less like art and more like warnings in a language Marcus couldn't read. Dave answered, the intercom on the 3rd buzz, his voice crackling through the speaker like distant thunder. "Marcus? Yeah, come on up, mate. Level 4, apartment 4B. Just follow the smell of desperation and instant coffee." The lock buzzed, and Marcus pushed through the heavy glass door into a lobby that smelled of old carpet and something else. Something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The lift was broken, naturally, so Marcus climbed 4 flights of stairs that creaked ominously under his weight. Each landing had a single bare bulb that flickered intermittently, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of his passage. By the time he reached the 4th floor, his breath was coming in short gasps, though whether from exertion or the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of the building, he couldn't say. Dave's apartment was a study in controlled chaos. Books were stacked in precarious towers against every wall, covering subjects that ranged from Melbourne's colonial history to Aboriginal Dreamtime stories to urban exploration guides. Empty coffee cups formed archaeological layers on every surface, and the windows were covered with heavy curtains that blocked out most of the gray afternoon light. Dave himself looked like he'd been living underground for months. Pale, thin, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "Welcome to paradise, mate," Dave said, gesturing around the cluttered space with a gesture that was part pride, part apology. "It's not much, but it's cheap, and the neighbors mostly keep to themselves. Well, except for Mrs. Chen downstairs. She makes these noises at night. Anyway, you'll love it here. Very atmospheric." Marcus dropped his bag and moved to one of the windows, pulling back the curtain to peer down at Sorrow's End. From 4 stories up, the laneway looked even more ominous. A crack in the urban landscape that seemed to swallow light. He could see movement down there. Shadows that might have been people, though they moved in ways that didn't look quite right. "What's the story with that alley?" he asked. Dave joined him at the window, and Marcus noticed his friend's reflection looked oddly distorted in the glass, stretched and thin, like a funhouse mirror image. "Sorrow's End? Yeah, that's got quite a history. Used to be called Murphy's Lane, after some Irish bloke who owned a pub down there back in the 1850s. But people started calling it Sorrow's End after things started happening." "What kind of things?" Dave was quiet for a long moment, his breath fogging the window as he stared down into the depths of the laneway. "Disappearances, mostly. Not the usual kind. Not people running off or getting mugged or anything like that. People would go into the laneway and just vanish. Sometimes their clothes would be found later, folded neat as you please on a doorstep somewhere else in the city. But never the people." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with Melbourne's notoriously changeable weather. "And the cops never investigated?" "Oh, they did. Back in the day, anyway. But what can you investigate when there's no crime scene? No body, no evidence of foul play? Just empty clothes and a laneway that gives everyone the willies?" Dave turned away from the window, but not before Marcus caught something in his expression. Fear, maybe, or something deeper and more troubling. "Anyway, that was all years ago. Decades even. Nothing's happened recently." But as Dave spoke, Marcus thought he saw something move in the depths of Sorrow's End. A figure that seemed to flow rather than walk, disappearing into shadows that shouldn't have been deep enough to hide anything. He blinked, and the laneway was empty again. Just concrete and graffiti, and the slowly gathering dusk. That night, Marcus lay on the fold-out couch that served as his bed, and listened to the sounds of the city settling around him. Melbourne's nighttime symphony was different from Sydney's. There was something rawer about it, something that spoke of older streets and deeper secrets. The trams clanged in the distance, their bells echoing through the urban canyons like the tolling of some mechanical church. Somewhere above him, Mrs. Chen was making the noises Dave had mentioned, a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to follow no particular pattern, but never quite stopped. Around midnight, he heard footsteps in Sorrow's End. They were slow, deliberate, echoing off the narrow walls with a strange resonance that made them sound like they were coming from underwater. Marcus found himself drawn to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer down into the laneway. The streetlight at the far end threw long shadows that seemed to writhe and shift independent of their sources, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw someone walking slowly down the center of the alley. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like a long coat that billowed around them despite the still night air. They moved with an odd, gliding gait that reminded Marcus of the way seaweed moves in a current, and as they passed directly beneath his window, he caught a glimpse of their face, or what should have been their face. Instead, there was only darkness, a void that seemed to absorb the weak light from the street lamp and give nothing back. Marcus jerked back from the window, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it over the city's night sounds. When he looked, again, the laneway was empty, but the feeling of being watched remained, crawling up his spine like cold fingers. He closed the curtain and retreated to the couch. But sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally did arrive, it brought dreams of walking through endless corridors that smelled of old flowers and echoed with footsteps that weren't his own. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, typical Melbourne weather that seemed designed to reflect the city's moody character. Marcus woke to the smell of coffee. Real coffee, not the instant stuff Dave had joked about, and found his friend standing at the kitchen counter with 2 steaming mugs and a newspaper spread open to the local news section. "Sleep well?" Dave asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. He handed Marcus a mug of coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead, and pointed to a small article buried in the back pages of the paper. "Might want to have a look at this." The headline read, "Local woman missing after night out in Fitzroy." Below it was a photo of a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile, identified as Sarah Chen, age 24, last seen leaving a bar on Brunswick Street around 1 a.m. The article was brief, mentioning that her friends had expected her to walk home to her apartment. An apartment, Marcus realized with a sinking feeling, that was somewhere in this very building. "Chen," Marcus said slowly. "Any relation to Mrs. Chen upstairs?" "Her granddaughter," Dave confirmed. And suddenly the nocturnal tapping from the apartment above took on a different, more heartbreaking significance. Sarah was a good kid. Architecture student at Melbourne Uni, worked part-time at one of those trendy coffee shops on DeGrave Street. She knew this area like the back of her hand. No way she just got lost or wandered off. Marcus thought about the figure he'd seen in Sorrow's End the night before, the way it had moved like something not quite human. He wanted to mention it to Dave, but something held him back. Maybe the rational part of his mind that insisted he'd been tired, stressed, seeing things that weren't there. Instead, he asked, "Have the police been around?" Briefly. Took a statement from Mrs. Chen, asked a few questions around the neighborhood. But you know how it is. Young woman, late night, big city. They'll file a report and hope she turns up on her own. Dave's voice carried a bitterness that spoke of experience with institutional indifference. In the meantime, Mrs. Chen's going spare with worry. Hence the tapping. She's performing some kind of traditional ritual, trying to call Sarah's spirit home. The coffee suddenly tasted like ash in Marcus's mouth. He set the mug down and moved to the window again, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name. Sorrow's End looked different in the gray morning light. Smaller, more ordinary. Just another narrow laneway in a city full of them. But there was something. At the far end, near where the shadows gathered deepest, that caught his eye. Something white and rectangular, lying on the wet pavement like a dropped handkerchief. "Dave," he said slowly, "what's that down there?" Dave joined him at the window, following Marcus's pointing finger. When he saw the white object, his face went pale. "Christ," he whispered. "We need to call the cops." But Marcus was already moving, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. Something about the white rectangle pulled at him with an urgency he couldn't explain, a feeling that if they waited for the police, something important would be lost forever. Dave called after him, but Marcus was already taking the stairs 3 at a time, his footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell like gunshots. The lobby smelled even more strongly of old flowers, and as Marcus pushed through the glass door onto the street, he noticed that the usual city sounds seemed muffled, distant, as if he were hearing them through water. Sorrow's End yawned before him, and despite the morning light, the shadows at the far end seemed impenetrable, dark as velvet curtains hiding some cosmic stage. He walked slowly into the laneway, his footsteps echoing off the narrow walls with that same underwater quality he'd noticed the night before. The graffiti on the walls seemed different up close. Not the usual tags and political slogans he was used to, but something older, more primitive. Symbols that looked like they might have been carved rather than painted. Spirals and angular, shapes that hurt to look at directly, as if they were trying to fold space around themselves. The white object was an envelope, thick and expensive looking, lying in a puddle that reflected the gray sky like a mirror. Marcus knelt beside it, noting that despite lying in standing water, the envelope was completely dry. His name was written on the front in elegant handwriting that seemed to shift and change as he looked at it, sometimes appearing in English, sometimes in characters he didn't recognize but somehow understood. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address, 234 Little Burke Street, and below that, a single line. She walks the old paths now. Come alone if you would see her again. Marcus's hands shook as he read the message. Little Burke Street was in Chinatown, a part of the city he'd never visited but had heard about. One of the oldest continuous settlements in Melbourne, built on land that had been sacred to the Wurundjeri people, long before European settlement. As he stood there in the growing shadows of Sorrow's End, holding an impossible message about a woman he'd never met, Marcus felt the weight of something vast and ancient settling around him like a shroud. Behind him, he heard Dave calling his name, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. When Marcus turned to look back toward the mouth of the laneway, Dave appeared as a tiny figure silhouetted against the gray morning light, gesturing frantically but making no sound. The distance between them stretched impossibly, as if the laneway itself was growing longer, and Marcus realized with a cold certainty that he had crossed some invisible threshold, stepped from the world he knew into something else entirely. He pocketed the letter and walked toward the far end of Sorrow's End, where the shadows waited like hungry mouths. With each step, the graffiti on the walls became more elaborate, more disturbing, spiraling into patterns that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. The air grew thick and humid, carrying scents that had no place in urban Melbourne, eucalyptus and burning bark, but also something darker, more organic, like soil that had been turned over too many times. At the end of the laneway, where it should have opened onto the next street, there was instead a wall covered in the most complex graffiti Marcus had ever seen. But as he approached, he realized it wasn't graffiti at all. The symbols were carved deep into the brick, and some of them seemed to glow with a faint phosphorescent light. At the center of this impossible mural was a doorway that hadn't been there moments before, its frame carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Beyond the doorway lay not another street, but a corridor that stretched into darkness deeper than anything Marcus had ever seen. The walls were lined with what looked like Aboriginal rock paintings, but the images they depicted were wrong somehow. Human figures with too many limbs, animals that existed nowhere in nature, and spirals that seemed to descend infinitely inward. The air that drifted from the corridor carried the sound of distant chanting, and the smell of smoke from fires that had burned for tens of thousands of years. Marcus knew he should turn back, knew that what lay before him was impossible and dangerous, and probably fatal. But the letter in his pocket seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, he could hear footsteps, slow, measured, echoing with that same underwater quality that had haunted his first night in the warehouse. And underlying the footsteps was another sound, barely audible but unmistakably human. Someone crying. He stepped through the doorway. The corridor beyond was longer than it had any right to be, stretching into a darkness that wasn't simply the absence of light, but something more active and hungry. The walls were covered with paintings that seemed to shift and change as Marcus passed, telling stories in a visual language that bypassed his conscious mind and spoke directly to something deeper and more primitive. He saw the arrival of the first Europeans, their ships cutting through water that had run red with blood. He saw the displacement of the Wurundjeri people, their sacred sites bulldozed and paved over, their song lines severed like cut nerves. And he saw something else, something that had been awakened by all that trauma and displacement, something that fed on sorrow and grew stronger with each injustice. The crying was louder now, echoing off the corridor walls with a resonance that suggested vast spaces beyond what he could see. Marcus found himself moving faster, drawn by a compulsion that felt like a fishhook in his chest, pulling him deeper into the impossible architecture of this place that existed somewhere between Melbourne's past and present. The corridor opened into a vast cavern that couldn't possibly exist beneath the streets of Fitzroy. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, and the walls were covered with more of the shifting paintings, their phosphorescent glow providing the only light. In the center of the cavern was a pool of water, so black and still it looked like a mirror made of obsidian, and around its edges sat dozens of figures in various states of decomposition. Some looked recently dead, their clothes still recognizable as modern garments, their features still mostly human. Others had been there longer, reduced to bones and tatters of fabric, but somehow still possessed of a terrible semblance of life. And at the far end of the spectrum were things that might once have been human, but had been transformed by their time in this place into something else entirely, elongated and twisted, their bones stretched like taffy, their eyes replaced by empty sockets that wept streams of black water. All of them were crying, their tears flowing into the black pool with the sound of rain on a tin roof. And standing at the edge of the pool, her back to Marcus, was a young woman with dark hair, wearing the same clothes described in the newspaper article about Sarah Chen's disappearance. "Sarah?" Marcus called, his voice echoing strangely in the vast space. The woman turned, and Marcus saw that while her face was still recognizably human, her eyes had been replaced by the same empty sockets that wept black tears. When she spoke, her voice carried the sound of wind through empty spaces and the whisper of old leaves. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, though her lips didn't move. The words seemed to emanate from the cavern itself, carried by the constant sound of weeping. This place, it feeds on sorrow, on all the pain that's been buried under concrete and asphalt, all the stories that were never told, all the songs that were never finished. Marcus wanted to ask her how she knew his name, wanted to ask a dozen questions about this impossible place and how she'd come to be here, but the words died in his throat as something moved in the depths of the black pool. The surface, which had been mirror still, began to ripple outward in concentric circles, and from the depths rose something that defied description, a presence rather than a physical form, vast and ancient and hungry beyond human comprehension. "The bunyip," Sarah whispered, though the word seemed inadequate for what Marcus was witnessing. "That's what the Wurundjeri called it, but it's older than names, older than language. It's the pain of the land itself, all the suffering that's been poured into this place like poison into a well." The thing in the pool rose higher, and Marcus caught glimpses of what might have been eyes the size of dinner plates, skin that looked like oil on water, and appendages that moved with their own malevolent intelligence. But more than its physical form, it was the presence of the thing that threatened to drive Marcus to his knees, a weight of sorrow and rage so profound that it made his own troubles seem like drops in an ocean. "It's been feeding for so long," Sarah continued, her empty sockets turned toward the black pool. "Every person who disappears, every story that gets buried, every injustice that goes unanswered, it all ends up here, feeding this thing, and in return, it gives us peace of a sort. Marcus looked around at the crying figures arranged around the pool and understood with a sick certainty what kind of peace Sarah was talking about. They weren't dead, not exactly, but they weren't alive either. They were something in between. Their sorrow transformed into sustenance for the ancient hunger that dwelt in the depths of the pool. "You can still leave," Sarah said, and for a moment, her voice sounded almost human again. "The way back is still open. But if you stay, if you let it take your pain away, you'll never hurt again. Never feel loss or disappointment or regret. Only the peace of eternal sorrow." The offer was tempting in a way that terrified Marcus. The divorce, the job loss, the sense of failure that had driven him from Sydney to Melbourne, all of it could be gone, transformed into something that fed, a purpose larger than himself. He could feel the thing in the pool reaching out to him, not with physical appendages, but with tendrils of influence that caressed his mind like gentle fingers. But as the alien presence touched his thoughts, Marcus saw something else. A vision of Melbourne's streets, empty of people. The last of the city's inhabitants drawn down into this cavern to feed the growing hunger below. He saw the black pool spreading, seeping up through storm drains and subway tunnels, turning the Yarra River into a stream of liquid sorrow. He saw the Aboriginal songlines, already damaged by centuries of displacement and destruction, finally severed entirely as the land itself was consumed by an ancient pain that refused to heal. "No," Marcus said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "This isn't peace. This is just giving up." The presence in the pool recoiled at his words, and for a moment, the constant sound of weeping faltered. Around the edges of the cavern, some of the crying figures looked up with interest, as if they hadn't heard anything but sorrow for so long that hope had become a foreign concept. "The land remembers," Marcus continued, the words coming from some deep well of understanding he hadn't known he possessed. "It remembers the songs and the stories and the ceremonies. But it also remembers that healing is possible, that pain doesn't have to be permanent." He thought about Mrs. Chen upstairs, tapping out her rhythmic patterns in an attempt to call her granddaughter home. It wasn't just grief. It was also an act of love, a refusal to let go, a belief that connection could transcend even death. And he thought about Dave, living surrounded by books about Melbourne's history, not because he was obsessed with the past, but because he believed that understanding could lead to healing. "Sarah," he said, turning to face the woman by the pool. "Your grandmother is waiting for you. She's been calling your name every night since you disappeared. She refuses to give up hope." For the first time since Marcus had entered the cavern, Sarah's expression changed. The empty sockets that had wept black tears filled with something that might have been light, and when she spoke, her voice carried the faintest echo of human warmth. She's really been calling for me?" "Every night, tapping out the old rhythms, trying to guide you home." Marcus took a step toward her, and though the presence in the pool writhed with displeasure, it didn't try to stop him. "You don't have to stay here. The sorrow you're feeding, it's not yours to carry. It belongs to the land, and the land knows how to heal if we give it the chance." Around the pool, other figures were beginning to stir. A man in what looked like a 19th century coat stood slowly, his movements uncertain but deliberate. A woman in 1950s dress wiped the black tears from her cheeks and looked around as if seeing the cavern for the first time. Even some of the more transformed figures seemed to be remembering something of their humanity, their elongated limbs drawing back toward more normal proportions. The thing in the pool rose higher, and Marcus felt its rage like a physical force, pressing against his chest and threatening to drive the air from his lungs. But underlying the rage was something else. Fear. For the first time in centuries, maybe millennia, the ancient hunger was facing the possibility of losing its hold on the accumulated sorrow it had been feeding on. "You think you understand," the presence spoke, its voice like the sound of grinding stone and flowing water. "But you know nothing of the depth of pain this land has endured. The broken promises, the stolen children, the songs that will never be sung again. How can such wounds ever heal?" Marcus felt the truth of the entity's words like a weight on his soul. The suffering it spoke of was real, vast, and in many ways beyond repair. But as he stood there in the impossible cavern beneath Melbourne's streets, surrounded by the spirits of the lost and the forgotten, he understood something else as well. "They can't heal if we keep feeding them to you," he said. "Sorrow isn't meant to be hoarded and preserved. It's meant to be felt, acknowledged, and then transformed into something else. Wisdom, maybe. Compassion. The determination to do better." He looked around at the cavern walls, at the shifting paintings that told the story of Melbourne's hidden history. But now, instead of focusing on the pain and displacement, he began to see other images. Moments of reconciliation, times when the divided communities of the city had come together, small acts of understanding that had begun to weave the severed songlines back together. "The land doesn't just remember the trauma," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "It remembers every act of kindness, every moment of connection, every time someone chose hope over despair. That's what Mrs. Chen is doing when she calls. For Sarah, she's choosing love over loss, connection over separation." Sarah was walking toward him now, her steps growing more solid and human with each pace. Behind her, the other figures around the pool were beginning to move as well, some of them remembering voices they hadn't used in decades, calling out names of people they'd left behind in the world above. The presence in the pool thrashed in, fury, sending waves of black water crashing against the cavern walls. But with each person who stepped away from the pool's edge, its power seemed to diminish, its form becoming less substantial, more transparent. "This isn't over," it raged, its voice echoing from every surface of the cavern. "The pain will return. It always returns, and when it does, I will be waiting." "Maybe," Marcus acknowledged, "but next time, we'll be ready for you. Because now we know you're here, and we know that healing is possible even for wounds this deep." Sarah reached him then, and when she took his hand, her fingers felt warm and solid and completely human. Around them, the cavern was beginning to change, the walls growing lighter, the oppressive weight of accumulated sorrow lifting like fog before the morning sun. The black pool was receding, its surface becoming clear and still, reflecting not the cavern ceiling, but glimpses of Melbourne's streets above. Collins Street with its buskers and coffee shops, Federation Square with its geometric architecture, the Yarra River flowing brown and peaceful under the city's bridges. "How do we get home?" Sarah asked, and Marcus realized he could see her eyes again, brown and warm and utterly human. "The same way we got here," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he meant. "We follow the song." And indeed, he could hear it now, a rhythm that had been underlying everything else, so faint he'd barely noticed it until this moment. It was the sound of Mrs. Chen's tapping from the apartment above, but also something more. the heartbeat of the city itself, the rhythm of trams on rails and feet on pavement and rain on rooftops. It was the song of Melbourne, wounded but healing, ancient but constantly renewed, a melody that wove together all the disparate threads of the city's sprawling, multicultural tapestry. Following that rhythm, Marcus led Sarah and the others back, through the corridor that was no longer impossible, but simply a passage between one state of being and another. The rock paintings on the walls had changed too, showing not just trauma and displacement, but also reunion, reconciliation, the slow work of healing that happened one conversation, one act of understanding, one moment of connection at a time. When they emerged from the doorway at the end of Sorrow's End, it was to find the laneway filled with people. Dave, Mrs. Chen, several police officers, and what looked like half the residents of the warehouse building. Mrs. Chen cried out when she saw Sarah, rushing forward to embrace her granddaughter with tears streaming down her face. The reunion was so heartfelt that even the police officers seemed to forget their questions for a moment, simply watching as two souls found each other again across an impossible distance. The other figures from the cavern dispersed more quietly, some of them fading away like morning mist as they found whatever peace they'd been seeking. Others walking off into the city to begin the complex process of reconnecting with lives they'd thought were lost forever. A few stopped to nod their thanks to Marcus, and he saw in their faces a mixture of gratitude and wonder that he knew would stay with him for the rest of his life. Dave approached him as the crowd began to disperse, his expression equal parts relief and bewilderment. "Mate, you've been gone for 3 hours. Sarah's been missing for 2 days. The police were about to drag the river. Where the hell were you?" Marcus looked back at the end of Sorrow's End, where the impossible doorway had been. Now there was just a brick wall covered with normal graffiti, tags and political slogans, and someone's phone number scrawled in black marker. But if he looked carefully, he could still see faint traces of the carved symbols. And he knew that the doorway wasn't gone, just hidden, waiting for the next time the city's accumulated sorrow grew too heavy to bear. "I went looking for answers," he said finally, "and I found more than I bargained for." The police asked their questions, took their statements, and filed their reports. But Marcus could see in their eyes that they didn't really expect to understand what had happened. How could they? The truth was too large, too strange, too intimately connected to the hidden history of their city to fit into any official narrative. Sarah told them she'd been drugged at the bar and had wandered around confused for days, eventually ending up in a squat somewhere in the northern suburbs. It wasn't true, but it was believable, and sometimes believable was enough. That night, as Marcus lay on Dave's fold-out couch listening to the sounds of the city settling around him, he heard Mrs. Chen upstairs, not tapping out rhythms of calling and longing, but the quiet sounds of a family reunited, voices murmuring in Mandarin, and the occasional burst of gentle laughter. The sound was better than any symphony he'd ever heard. Over the following weeks, Marcus began to notice changes in Melbourne, subtle shifts that might have been his imagination, but felt profoundly real. The coffee tasted richer, the street art seemed more vibrant, and the conversations he overheard on trams carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. It was as if the city itself had been holding its breath for centuries and was finally beginning to exhale. He also began to notice the connections. Aboriginal names preserved in suburb titles, walking tours that included stories of the Wurundjeri people alongside tales of European settlement, community gardens planted on vacant lots with native plants and vegetables from a dozen different cultures. The songlines were still damaged, might always be damaged to some extent, but people were beginning to weave new connections across the old wounds, creating something that honored both the past and the possibility of a different future. Dave threw himself into documenting what they'd experienced, turning his apartment into an informal research center for Melbourne's hidden history. He interviewed elderly residents about strange experiences they'd had in the city's laneways, collected Aboriginal oral histories that spoke of places where the boundary between worlds grew thin, and maintained a careful catalog of disappearances that showed patterns stretching back more than a century. "The thing is," he said one afternoon as they sat in a Daygrave street cafe, surrounded by the cheerful chaos of Melbourne's coffee culture, "I don't think what you did down there was defeat that thing. I think you just changed the rules of engagement." Marcus nodded, stirring his flat white and watching the street performers outside the window. A busker was playing didgeridoo, while a young Chinese woman accompanied him on violin, their music weaving together in ways that shouldn't have worked, but somehow created something beautiful and new. "It's still there," Marcus agreed. "I can feel it sometimes, especially when the city feels particularly divided, or when the news is especially grim. But it's not feeding the same way anymore. Instead of hoarding sorrow, it's being, I don't know, composted maybe, transformed into something that can actually nourish instead of just consuming." Sarah joined them sometimes for these conversations, her experiences in the cavern having given her a perspective on grief and healing that she channeled into her architecture studies. She was working on a thesis about creating public spaces that acknowledged trauma while encouraging connection, designing buildings that could hold pain without being consumed by it. "The Aboriginal concept of country isn't just about geography," she explained during one of these discussions. "It's about the relationship between land and people and stories and law. When that relationship is damaged, both the land and the people suffer. But relationships can be repaired, even very damaged ones, if you're willing to do the work." Marcus had found work with a community organization that facilitated conversations between Melbourne's many cultural groups, helping to weave the kinds of connections that strengthen the city's social fabric. It wasn't glamorous work, and the progress was often frustratingly slow, but he'd learned in the cavern beneath Sorrow's End that healing happened one conversation at a time, one small act of understanding building on another, until something new and stronger emerged from the accumulated effort. Mrs. Chen had become something of a neighborhood matriarch, her apartment serving as an unofficial community center where people gathered to share stories, practice traditional crafts, and maintain connections that transcended cultural and generational boundaries. The rhythmic tapping Marcus had heard that first night had evolved into regular music sessions where traditional Chinese instruments accompanied Aboriginal didgeridoos, Greek bouzoukis, and whatever else people brought to contribute to the growing symphony of the building's collective life. On quiet nights, when the city settled into its deepest sleep and the only sounds were the distant clank of trams and the whisper of wind through the urban canyons, Marcus would sometimes hear echoes from the cavern below, not the desperate weeping that had once filled that space, but something more like singing. Voices raised not in lament, but in hope, stories being told and retold, gradually transforming pain into wisdom and isolation into connection. Sorrow's End had returned to being Murphy's Lane on the city maps, though locals still sometimes used the old name, usually with a smile that suggested shared knowledge of secrets that couldn't quite be spoken aloud. The graffiti on its walls had evolved too, becoming less aggressive and more contemplative, with pieces that celebrated the laneway's role as a passage between different states of being. Someone had painted a mural near the spot where the impossible doorway had appeared, showing hands of different colors reaching toward each other across a map of Melbourne, and below it, in elegant script, the words, "Every ending is also a beginning." Marcus often walked through the laneway on his way to and from work, partly because it was convenient, but mostly because he felt a responsibility to maintain some kind of watch over the threshold he'd helped to redefine. The presence below was still there. He could sense it sometimes, vast and patient, and no longer entirely malevolent. It was still feeding, but on different sustenance now. Acts of reconciliation, moments of understanding, the slow work of healing that transformed ancient wounds into fertile ground for new growth. 6 months after Sarah's return, Marcus was walking through Murphy's Lane on his way home from a particularly productive community meeting when he noticed someone sitting on a milk crate near the wall where the doorway had been. It was an elderly Aboriginal man he didn't recognize, wearing a worn flannel shirt and jeans, his weathered hands holding what looked like a traditional carved boomerang. "You're the one who went down below," the man said as Marcus approached. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Marcus replied, settling onto another milk crate that seemed to materialize beside him. "Though I'm still not entirely sure what I accomplished. Down there." The old man smiled, his eyes crinkling with what might have been amusement. "You reminded an old spirit what healing looks like. My people have stories about places like this, wounds in the land that become infected when they're not properly tended, but we also have stories about healing, about how even the deepest cuts can be stitched back together if you're patient and careful and willing to honor what was lost while still moving forward." He held up the boomerang, and Marcus could see that it was covered with intricate carved patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the lamplight. "This belonged to my great-grandfather. He used to tell stories about the old days, before the city covered everything, when the song lines ran, clear and strong. But he also told stories about the future, about a time when all the different peoples of this land would learn to sing together." "Do you think that's possible?" Marcus asked. "I think it's happening," the old man replied, standing slowly and tucking the boomerang into his belt. "Slowly, with plenty of setbacks and false starts. But it's happening. The spirit below knows it too. That's why it's changing, why it's learning to feed on healing instead of just pain." He paused at the mouth of the laneway, turning back to look at Marcus with eyes that held depths of knowledge accumulated over decades of patient observation. "Keep doing what you're doing, young fella. Keep having those conversations. Keep building those bridges. And don't worry too much about the spirit below. As long as people like you keep feeding it the right kind of stories, it'll be fine. It might even become something beautiful, given enough time." With that, he walked off into the Melbourne night, his figure quickly absorbed by the city's maze of streets and laneways. Marcus sat alone in Murphy's Lane for a while longer, listening to the city's night sounds and feeling the slow, steady pulse of something vast and ancient beneath his feet. Not hungry anymore, but patient and hopeful, and gradually transforming from a wound into a wellspring. When he finally made his way back to the warehouse building, he found Dave in the lobby, checking the mail with a distracted expression that suggested he was thinking about one of his research projects. They climbed the stairs together, their footsteps echoing in the familiar rhythm that had become as much a part of Marcus's life as his own heartbeat. "Any word from the council about the laneway preservation project?" Marcus asked as they reached the 4th floor. "Better than that," Dave replied, grinning as he unlocked his apartment door. "They've approved funding for a cultural heritage trail that includes Murphy's Lane. Nothing too flashy, just some interpretive signage and maybe a small memorial garden. But it's a start." Inside the apartment, They could hear the soft sounds of Mrs. Chen's evening gathering, voices in multiple languages sharing stories and laughter, music that blended traditions from around the world into something uniquely Melbourne. The sound was warm and welcoming, a sonic representation of everything Marcus had learned about healing in the months since his journey into the cavern below. As he settled onto the familiar fold-out couch that had become his temporary but increasingly permanent home, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since his arrival in Melbourne. He'd come here to escape his problems, but what he'd found instead was a different way of understanding them, not as isolated personal failures, but as part of the larger human story of loss and recovery, trauma and resilience, the eternal struggle to create meaning and connection in the face of an often hostile universe. The city outside his window hummed with its familiar night sounds, trams and traffic and the distant sound of people calling out to each other in the streets. But underneath it all, Marcus could hear something else. The slow, steady rhythm of a community learning to sing together, voices finding harmony across difference, stories being woven into a tapestry strong enough to hold both sorrow and joy, without being torn apart by either. Melbourne had taught him that healing wasn't about forgetting or moving on, but about transformation, taking the raw material of pain and slowly, patiently, working it into something that could nourish rather than poison, something that could connect rather than divide. It was hard work, often frustrating, sometimes seeming impossible. But the results were already visible to anyone who knew how to look. In community gardens growing on former brownfield sites, in art projects that brought together artists from different cultural backgrounds, in conversations that acknowledged historical wrongs, while still believing in the possibility of a better future. As sleep finally began to claim him, Marcus thought about the spirit in the cavern below. Gradually, learning to feed on reconciliation instead of resentment, on hope instead of despair. It was still vast and ancient and not entirely comprehensible to human minds, but it was also becoming something else. Not just a repository for accumulated trauma, but an active participant in the work of healing. Its immense power slowly turning toward creation rather than consumption. The last thing he heard before drifting off was the sound of rain beginning to fall on Melbourne's complicated geography of rooftops and laneways, washing the city clean for another day of small miracles and gradual progress, another 24 hours of people choosing connection over isolation, understanding over prejudice, hope over despair. Tomorrow there would be more conversations to facilitate, more bridges to build, more stories to collect and preserve and weave into the growing tapestry of the city's collective memory. And far below, in spaces that existed between the mapped geography of Melbourne streets, something vast and patient continued its own slow transformation, fed by every act of kindness and understanding that took place in the city above, gradually becoming not just a keeper of sorrows, but a guardian of possibilities, a protector of the fragile but growing web of connections that bound Melbourne's disparate communities into something approaching a true urban family. The rain continued to fall, gentle and persistent, soaking into the earth beneath the concrete and asphalt, nourishing roots that had been waiting decades for the right conditions to grow. In gardens and parks across the city, seeds that had lain dormant began to stir, preparing to push through the soil toward light they had never seen, but somehow knew was waiting for them. And in the spaces between sleep and waking, between dream and reality, the city itself seemed to sigh with something that might have been contentment. The sound of an ancient wound finally beginning to heal, one drop of rain at a time, one small act of connection at a time, one story at a time. until the accumulated weight of all that patient work transformed even the deepest scars into sources of strength and renewal. Marcus slept and dreamed of singing,